one of our bike service techs and I are going to show you the basics of sag setup. Jason is riding up on our bike. And what we're going to do is we're going to set this thing up as per Jason's weight. This is an important part of the Fox Racing shock setup. Jason is on a cross-country bike. The difference between this bike and a bike that, say, a downhiller would use is on this bike, Jason's going to remain seated. But if he were going to do the downhill, if he were on a downhill bike, what I would do is hold on to the front end of his bike, which is what you guys should do in your shop, and then Jason have him stand up in his attack position. We want his natural position on the bike in order to correctly set our sag. So since we're on the cross-country mode, we're going to set him back down in the saddle, and we're going to let him bounce on the bike a time or two to make sure that the suspension is settled. We're going to push our rings down, and then without bouncing, we're going to have Jason climb off of the bike. Now what we're looking for, since this particular shock is an 1.5 inch travel shock, we're looking for 3/8 of an inch from the O-ring to the bottom of our dust wiper seal. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my tape, I'm going to make that measurement, and we can see that I'm a little bit long on my measurement, so I want to add a little bit of pressure to this shock in order to reduce this distance just a little bit and have the sag correct for Jason's rider weight. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a little bit of air pressure to this shock, and we're going to actually overfill it just a little bit, and then we'll let the air out in order to get to our desired sag setup that we're looking for. So we'll stick the pump on. And we're going to pump it up a little bit. And in this case, I'm going to put about an extra 25 pounds or so. And then we will have Jason sit on this thing again, and then we will have a second look at our O-ring and see where we are. And again, Jason's going to pump on the bike a time or two. We're going to make sure that the suspension settles. We're going to push the ring back up. And then without bouncing, and that's usually the hardest part, is have Jason get back off again. And we're going to remeasure. And that's where we want to be.
So Mike, we just set up my cross-country bike. What about my downhill bike?
There's really no difference between the cross-country bike and the downhill bike as far as shock sag setup is concerned. The differences in the frames are all taken in by measuring the stroke length of the shock and not the rear wheel travel. So sag is sag regardless of the bike style. So we've concluded with Jason's rear shock. We have it set up for his body weight and it's now in the ideal spot. Our next step is to do the same thing with the fork, and we're going to measure it the same way. We're going to put Jason back on the bike, we're going to have him settle the suspension, and then we're going to check our indicator to see where we are. So this is where we're going. So what we've done is we put Jason back on the bike, we've pushed our NIRAP down to the top of the fork seal, we're going to have him settle the suspension, and then again gently get off the bike without moving the suspension. So I push it back down. And again, we get Jason to get off. Now you can see on this particular fork, it's a 100 millimeter fork. I am looking for about 1/2 inch of sag, and we can see that we're far less than that, probably 1/4 inch or so. So just like the rear shock, what I'll do is I'll let a little bit of air out in order to allow this fork to drop and put the sag in the correct position. Now our front and rear ends are set up correct for the sag. This affects the balance of the bike, this affects the steering, the performance of the bike, and now the bike is going to work the way the manufacturer intended. So we can see that our sag is a little bit too low here. We have about 1/4 inch, and for a 100 millimeter fork, we would like to see 1/2 inch of sag. I'm going to let a little air out. We're going to let this thing settle just a little bit. This is something you can do on your sales floor. It's quick and it's easy, and it ensures. Jason, why don't you go ahead and climb off the bike? Let's see where we are. Well, it needs a little bit more, as you can see, but it doesn't take much, just a little push, and you're getting down to the area that you need to be. Whoops, that was a lot. Go ahead and climb off again. Now we're a little bit closer to our 1/2 inch. This is what we would like to see. And again, we want to measure it, and I'm right there at 1/2 inch. So now I have the front and rear set up correctly for the sag for this bike and for Jason. So now Jason, I have the front of your bike set up and the rear of your bike set up. The beauty of all of this is now the bike has the balance that it's looking for. If you've got too much sag in the rear, you know the bike's going to hang back kind of like a chopper. Your steering is going to be a little bit slow, and the thing is going to understeer in corners. If you have the rear set up too stiffly and the front too soft, this thing is going to be up on its nose all of the time. It's uncomfortable at best. It'll also tend to make it a little bit twitchy in its steering. Having the sag correct, front and rear, restores that balance on your bike, and therefore you'll be able to fly down the trails.
Okay, so now that we got the sag set front and rear, Mike, what about the rebound knob and the compression adjusters?
Well, there's a lot of features with our product that give this thing a huge amount of range, and it's really easy to get lost here. But what we're looking for with rebound, our red knob that's on our shock here, is you want the rebound slow enough that when you hit a square edge bump or you go off a curb, that the back end of the bike doesn't bounce multiple times. But you want it fast enough that if you go riding down a flight of stairs, that the rear shock doesn't do a thing called packing down. The rebound is so slow that the shock doesn't have the chance to recover for the next hit. And how you can tell it's too slow is when you get down near the bottom of those stairs, the last 4 or 5 steps, it'll feel like you're bottoming all the time. And the reason that you are bottoming is the shock never has a chance to come back to collect the next hit. Does that make sense so far?
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. Now, you want to know about compression. That was the second knob that you asked about, and on Fox products, compression is always blue colored. On a shock that has adjustable compression, you want the compression to be soft enough that when you go down through a rocky section, that the back end of the bike doesn't kick up and do what I call the devil dance. The bike will track straight through that section. You want it also firm enough that when you go off a big drop, that it doesn't blow all the way through the travel because that compression is too soft. So there's a fine line between the two places. Does that make sense to you?
Sure.
Oh, sweet. Now, you've done the devil dance before, I'll bet.
Too many times.
Well, we're trying to fix that so you won't do that anymore.
All right.
What we see here is our Fox F100 RLC fork, and this is for rebound, lockout, and compression. We have 3 knobs on the top of the fork, and then there's one on the bottom that we're going to talk about in a little bit. The first knob we're going to talk about is our rebound knob, and just like the rear shock, you want the rebound fast enough that the fork has a chance to recover from the previous hit, and yet slow enough that when it does hit the next hit, it doesn't kick the front end up in the air. We're going back to that devil dance sequence where when you go down a rocky trail, that the front end doesn't tend to wander. It allows you to steer the bike straight through the rough section. The difference here is when it goes straight through a rough section, it allows you to pedal through it. You're going to go through faster with less effort. And as a cross-country rider, that's very important. Our second control is a lockout control. On this particular fork, if we rotate this knob to the rear position, it makes this front end essentially locked out. It won't go up and down. When you're sprinting and you're beating your buddy to the city limit sign, that's the lever you pull back. It makes this fork rigid. You get all your power through the bike to the pedals. Our third knob on the top of the fork is the compression knob. And our compression knob has several clicks. It goes all the way to full firm or to full soft. And again, we're trying to control the front end movement through a rough section of ground. We want, again, just like the rebound controls, we want the compression controls soft enough to allow you to blow through a bumpy section, and yet firm enough that when you go off a drop, it doesn't blow through the travel. Our final adjuster is down at the bottom of the fork. We have a blue knob down here, and this controls our lockout. If we turn our knob all the way in, we're going to have a firm lockout that you will have to run into a small building in order to break the thing loose. On the other hand, if you roll the knob all the way out, just a little bump, like a little curb or a small step, will break that front end loose and allow that front end to have some movement and then go back into the lockout mode once the bike recovers from the bump. So Jason, that's your setup. You need to play with these things from this point on. I can't tell you how many clicks to put the rebound because I don't know what it's going to be. That's up to you. It's your riding style, your riding position. All of those things have an impact on that rebound knob. But you now know how rebound works and what you're looking for, so you can start playing with that knob a little bit to find that kind of a feel. And the same thing applies with the compression knobs. Again, it's totally individual. There is no right number. However, you now know how compression works, and if you know how that works, you know where to adjust the knob to make that feel so that you can go through that rocky section and pedal straight on through with no effort. Does that all make sense at this point?
Yes, it does, Mike. Thanks a lot.
You've got your setup in place. It's time to go ride and go experiment with it just a little bit.
All right.
And you can't hurt this thing by turning the knobs one way or the other. Well, oftentimes people will just put it right in the middle because they're afraid to try different things. And our suspension is so fluid that moving it from one end to the other, as far as the adjuster knobs are concerned, will make a huge impact on the quality of your ride. So you got to try it. It doesn't hurt to write down the settings when you get done. If you decide that your rebound, you're happiest with it 5 clicks out from our full closed position, jot it down somewhere. Because if you ever get lost at a race trying to get your bike set up differently, or you want to tweak it a little bit and you're not sure if you made it better or worse, you can go back to that number that you recorded. That is your new base setup. You go back to that, you know that works.
Well, hand me a notepad. Here, I'm ready to write it down.
There you go. All right, well, enjoy the ride.
Thanks, Michael.